everyone, and welcome to our fifth episode in this series, Understanding People, brought to you by getAbstract. I'm Kirsten Müller-Daubermann, and I am your host. So throughout this series, we're looking at all different types of interpersonal communication, exploring why we misunderstand each other, and bringing in authors and experts to help us learn how to connect with one another better. In this episode, we're going to explore the concept of empathy, why it is essential, and how to exercise and grow our empathy muscle in a way that is practical and absolutely applicable in our daily lives and relationships. My guest today is Kelsey Crowe, PhD. She is the author of There's No Good Card for This: What to Say and Do When Life is Scary, Awful, and Unfair to the People You Love. She is also the founder of the training company Empathy Bootcamp and is a breast cancer survivor. She earned her doctorate in social welfare at the University of California, Berkeley, and teaches social work at California State University. Kelsey is originally from Brooklyn and lives in San Francisco with her husband and daughter. Welcome, Kelsey, to the show.
Oh, thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, and are you joining us today from California?
I am from sunny San Francisco. This is natural lighting I have here.
Is it actually sunny? Because I know sometimes San Francisco can be quite gloomy, but you have sun. That's great. Yeah. So you are the expert. You literally wrote the book on empathy, which, if people want to check it out, is of course in the getAbstract library. But first of all, what is empathy? And I would be really curious to hear what got you started writing and speaking about this incredibly important topic.
Sure. I'll give a very simple explanation of empathy. Obviously, scholars in the fields of neuroscience and philosophy and psychology have a lot of debates about what is empathy, but most agree on some of the basic premises, which is that empathy can be conceived of two parts. The first part is what's called affective empathy. This is what we automatically feel emotionally in the presence of someone else's suffering. And many of us have experienced sadness when seeing someone who's sad. And on the other end is what people call either cognitive empathy or perspective-taking empathy. And this is our capacity to put ourselves in someone else's shoes and imagine what someone is going through. And affective empathy is considered important because it's our emotions that motivate us to act. But sometimes if we only have affective empathy, we can experience empathic distress and be overwhelmed. So having some level of distance is useful and can help even with some problem solving. And having then perspective-taking empathy with affective empathy is ideal. Too much perspective-taking empathy, where you're only analyzing a situation from one point of view, but not having any feelings around it, means you may not actually act on behalf of that person. You may understand what they're going through, but not be motivated to act. So this integration between affective and perspective-taking empathy is what can motivate us to act. And people have varying levels of perspective-taking or affective empathy by DNA and nurtures young kids, but they can use their empathy muscles and change that. How did I get into this work? It's such a long, winding road, but I was in public policy for a very long time, and I studied politics and power, and was very interested in a guide for myself that I thought others could use about what to do or say, and I only looked at Emily Post etiquette kinds of guides. And it was just through my exposure in this work that I learned about empathy and compassion, which at first I thought was too woo-woo, a little too mushy.
Yeah, from politics to empathy.
Right? Like, who needs empathy to make a deal? Yeah. And I started to understand how it creates in you and in others a sense of confidence and presence that makes any kind of deal making more possible, alongside relationships that are meaningful and productive. So this is, and I got so much out of this work that I've just grown it. So here I am.
Mm. It mentions in your bio that you are a breast cancer survivor, which I think is an incredible thing to put in there. And anyone who has gone through something like that and come out on the other side stronger is to be lauded for many reasons. And I'm wondering if your own personal experiences also led to you to want to help other people try to support a loved one or try to figure out what to do, what to say in these difficult situations where empathy may be required, but the people who are trying to give it have no idea what to do or say.
I have to say, very much so, my own experiences. Certainly, my first experience that launched this interest was actually my consternation about how to reach out to my friend who had breast cancer.
Oh,
This is
wow.
before I was sick. And I started developing survey research questions and asking people what worked and what didn't, and really committed to this work, but it was taking a while to churn it out. And then when I got breast cancer and all of these wonderful things were done for me that I didn't know how to do for others, I realized it's really important to get these gems of kindness that so many of us don't trust are impactful out there into the world. And that's what launched me to write the book, do the research, and the whole
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. And I really recommend that people go on it and obviously read the abstract, but also read Kelsey's book because it is that wonderful synthesis of both research and practical application. Things that are backed up by science and facts and delving into these questions, but also by just very practically working. And that leads to a very practical question. And that is that we can talk about these things in the abstract, how to practice or cultivate empathy, but why does the suffering of others make us so uncomfortable as humans?
I mean, research has shown how we have naturally an aversive response to aversive emotions. We don't want to be around them. We feel some contagion around that. So we try to avoid them. What's interesting, though, is, of course, we experience aversive feelings all the time in, for example, our work life, trying to manage a spreadsheet, trying to organize a meeting and schedule a meeting, right? These are all just total pains. But we anticipate the dopamine rush that comes from actually having accomplished something at the end of it. But if somebody is suffering and you can't fix it, you can't accomplish anything with their suffering, it's hard to motivate yourself to be around it. And so that's what's so important in this work, is recognizing how our small gestures can actually make a difference, and to trust that we actually can accomplish something by being there with others and actually experience some kind of paradoxical joy in suffering. And that joy is experienced, research has shown, in hindsight. When people recall a difficult time of their friend or even of their own, they often recall not the negative emotions, but the experiences of connection that create another dopamine rush.
Mm.
So trusting that there is some sense of satisfaction that comes from leaning into these aversive feelings
Oh,
is really important.
I love that. I love that reframing. Um, and it leads me to wonder, what is the worst thing someone ever said or did for you, thinking that they were helping you to try to make you feel better? And
Yeah.
what are some common pitfalls that people fall into when they try to fix the situation?
Yes. And it's always tricky because a big part of my research is based on my own story and my own type, which is that person that fails to reach out. So I'm reluctant to say what not to do, but I have to say there's a pretty extensive list of what not to do. And reading the research, I kept banging my head on the table because I recognized all of these mistakes, so to speak, that I was making in my life. So I'll tell you some that I experienced when I had breast cancer. Very commonly, people would leave books at my door or bring them to me about nutrition regimen or spiritual practice or about my psychology and how I contributed to my breast cancer to help me do a reframe, many things that suggested I caused this disease. And I felt very judged for having breast cancer. That was a big, big no-no. Also, people who did not respond to my request to help my husband. I had asked for help with childcare. We had a toddler, and he was super, super busy with work. I was really sick on chemo. I was just one of those people that didn't do well on chemo. And I asked our friends to help, and many didn't. And I think they didn't recognize how swamped we were in the day-to-day management of my disease.
Yeah. And what were some things, I guess the follow-up to that is naturally, what are things that people did that were really helpful?
This is what is so amazing about having had this experience with breast cancer, is it confirmed what I found in my research. Many people described the significance of small gestures, and indeed that was also my experience. For example, a woman I didn't know very well, but we were in a hiking club together for babies. She just left a meal on my doorstep, unsolicited. She just left it on my doorstep, knocked on the door, said, "Here you go," and she then went on her way. Another friend brought over a coconut, some kind of very random source of food, and with a knife and chopped it open.
Awesome.
Another posted his favorite song on my Facebook feed. I mean, these are small gestures that I'm recalling 8 years later. It's incredible. And a lot about these gestures is definitely that they are there, but it also is that, excuse me, I'm a little thirsty.
Go for it. Yeah, it's important. Water.
A lot of too, what matters about these gestures is the timing. So there may have been a lot of gestures that came my way that were equally special and valuable, but I didn't notice them. But these I noticed. I was like in a frame of mind where they noticed. And so we can make small gestures that support someone else. And we have to let go of the outcome that it's going to be remembered 8 years from now. You just can't predict that. But it's very possible that it will be.
And would you say that maybe some people, when confronted with a family member or a friend or something, even if it's someone they don't know very well who might be going through a difficult time or is suffering, they feel like if they don't do a huge thing, then they do nothing. But you're saying that even just tiny little things actually can make a huge impact.
Oh, yes. So in the workshops that I used to do in person, I have what's called a gesture wall, where people fill out gesture cards that describe something nice that someone did for them in their difficult time, and you put it on a wall. And seeing people take in what's on that wall, which 80% are the kinds of gestures that I described, is super impactful. Very few people describe some superhero that came by, stayed at the house for 7 days, cleaned, cooked. You know, that happens. Thank God that happens. But so much of what goes on there are these small incidental gestures. So important for us to know. And also, first, to know that it matters. And then second, to, self-efficacy theory is a very kind of obvious theory that when we think we can do something and achieve it, we're more likely to do it. So if we feel we can actually do a text and it matters, we're more likely to text. It's true. And so for us to really be convinced that these small gestures make such a difference should encourage us to make those small gestures when we feel that we can't do the big superhero gesture.
I love that. So small gestures, super important. Also, I'd love to just practically ask you, what are some good things to say?
Yeah, yes.
Because words can be both extremely helpful and hurtful.
Yeah.
And I would imagine too that there's kind of this releasing control, like trying to do the right thing, but then also releasing control of the outcome, like you just said, involved with words as well.
Completely. Releasing the expectation of outcome is so important in conversation. Again, when we think we have to fix someone's problem and be a superhero, we tend to give them advice or tend to compare their situation to something that's worse to help them feel
Oh my gosh, that's the worst. Sorry.
Ugh,
That's
at
the worst
least,
thing.
at least, at least.
No. Yeah.
There's many things that we say that inadvertently try to fix someone's problem, and that actually makes somebody feel even smaller. It does not typically make them feel supported and encouraged. So what you can say and do are things like, for example, someone's going through something difficult, say a divorce, to something smaller, struggling with how to strategize a difficult conversation with their boss. And they're just describing their experience. Rather than launch in with advice, you want to say, I know you're so capable at having these kind of difficult conversations. I really trust that you know what to do, even if it's not before you right now. Expressing faith in someone's judgment is super, super, super important. You can then say, if you want my advice, I can give some to you. And I also really trust your judgment. When somebody is feeling really unlovable, and this is difficult times, I mean, we're just full of aversive feelings that nobody wants to be around, right? Grief, sadness, anger, malaise, and we feel unlovable. And two schema for self-worth are feeling competent and feeling lovable. And when we feel unlovable, and often when we feel equally incompetent, when someone tells you, I admire you, or I love you, it just feels so helpful. So someone can write to you about how they're really struggling and sad. You can say, I am so sorry that you were feeling this, and I love you so much. Even if it's a colleague that you admire, you don't love them, you don't have the mushy, deep emotions, but you respect them. If you say somebody who's lost their job, say, I so admire that the work that you did, and I will help you to get another job, or LinkedIn them, message them right away, things like that. So there's things that you can do that are supportive, that are really about expressing faith in the person, faith in their judgment, faith in their overall competence and lovability. And then finally, when the pain is so obvious and the emotions just raw, just say, I'm sorry. And not, I'm sorry, I'd never want to be you.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry, messed up human to messed up human. I'm sorry. And that's the kind of sorry that people feel seen with.
So, so good. So many gems of wisdom there. I have two more questions. I have actually 1,000 more questions, but two more questions for the purpose of this conversation. One that just came into my mind, and that is that for someone, the person who may be going through a difficult time, it can be sometimes difficult to receive empathy.
Yeah.
What advice, because the person feels guilty, or to receive small gestures or big gestures, what advice or encouragement would you give the person on the receiving end of empathy to be able to do that well with grace and not with guilt?
It's very true that when we learn to receive support and care, people trust our support and care more.
Mm.
If you are the person that deflects care and support because you're too proud, and then you support someone else, that creates an unequal relationship where you're always the fixer, you're always the one that's got your stuff together, and this other person's the one that's always messed up. And it may be fine in the first couple of instances, but once a pattern starts to develop, that person who's suffering will cease to reach out to you, because in truth, people don't go to those whose life is perfect when they're feeling messed up, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of, that perfect person is really the last person you want to see when you're going through a divorce, when you're going through, right?
Yep.
It's the last person you want to see. So recognizing that if you really want to be compassionate to others and have that be, again, that kind of sorry, from messed up human to messed up human, learning to receive compassion is a big piece of that.
Yeah.
And
And-
also, sorry, just to
no,
add,
yeah, go ahead.
it gives you the experience of gratitude. And if we can hold gratitude instead of shame,
Mm.
that is an example of the dopamine rush that we get in these times of suffering. That's part of the paradox of suffering, that it can, in a very subversive way, actually result in some joy.
I I love that. And I can't help but be thinking that this also has such a wonderful application for leaders trying to build trust within a team,
Mm-hmm.
especially right now when everyone's remote working. And I can't tell you how many things on LinkedIn and all over the business community that we see trying to give leaders advice on how to build trust with their employees. And everything that you just said about being authentic, about telling someone that you admire their work, sharing their own struggles so that you can relate to them, so that they share theirs, not pretending to be a perfect person. I mean, just there's so many applications, not only within the personal realm, but also within the corporate setting, that this is how you build trust within a team. This is how you establish authentic leadership as, whatever leadership position you may be.
I'm so glad you're saying that, because my empathy trainings actually surprised me, because people would bring me in medical settings at first, right? That seems like an obvious setting.
Yeah.
Or in settings that have, patients with cancer, or some kind of setting like that, a health setting. And they wound up experiencing a lot of team building in the course of this workshop, that it was less about what they do for others outside the organization and more about how they support each other internally, because they were talking human to human. And the first in this 4-part series of the workshop, the Empathy Bootcamp workshop that I have, is empathy in times of suffering, to sort of strip off all of the roles and the statuses and the stereotypes. And, cancer knows no job or title or economic status or race. And so we all get into that well together. And then the second workshop and the third deals more with conflict that we have, that is about our different interests within a system, or our different racial identities, and how those play out. And how does empathy serve you then? Because it's one thing to have empathy for someone who's suffering, somebody who's grieving or ill. We may not know how to do it, but we recognize the need for it, right?
Yeah.
But when we're in conflict with somebody who has different goals, different values, beliefs, somebody who is frustrating us,
empathy is still required.
empathy is still required, and you don't want to give it. And in fact, you need it, right? Why am I the one to give empathy? They need to give it to me, if any, so really figuring out, how does empathy help break the gridlock that can happen in all kinds of workplaces and even politically. So the workshop really delves into harder and harder layers of both justifying the need for empathy and practicing it. So you're right, it's applicable in so many ways, but this empathy in times of suffering is critical just for laying a human foundation.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that, and we're going to be putting in the show notes a link to the Empathy Bootcamp, so you can learn more about those and the work that Kelsey does, if you are interested in that for your organization. Last question that I would like to ask you is, what do we do? And I mean, obviously we're more connected globally than ever before, and with social media and the digital world that we all live in, walking around with a computer essentially in our hand, we're able to see suffering all over the globe, not to mention the pandemic. And so with all of that comes the possibility of compassion fatigue.
Yeah.
So how do people who might be naturally more sensitive or empathic people not get overwhelmed and find that boundary between exercising the empathy muscle, but also keeping enough of an emotionally healthy distance so that they don't kind of sink into a black pit and not be able to climb out?
Yeah. Very relevant question. You mentioned that empathy muscle. So for those that naturally experience affective empathy for the suffering around them, fortunately in San Francisco, for example, we have a lot of homeless people everywhere. And you can feel more than affective empathy, you start to feel what's called empathic distress.
Mm.
And the truth is, once you feel empathic distress, you are unable to act. And so knowing that your deep experience of empathy nonstop can actually make you less effective. So it's really important to recognize that you're doing the world good and yourself good by minimizing how much exposure you have to these things, how much you take in, and selectively focusing on one or two things that you want to give your energies towards. So use some of that perspective taking empathy on yourself.
Mm.
Wow, I'm really feeling overwhelmed right now. Let me focus. Let me not read anything about this and this. Let me avoid these streets. Let me do, not because I'm a horrible person, but because I want to be a helpful person. So that's what I recommend.
Mm. I love it. Kelsey, that's going to wrap up our conversation, but really want to thank you so much for your insight, for your wisdom, for your time, and for joining us on the show. And of course, for writing the book. We very much appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. And shout out to my co-author, Emily McDowell, who did such amazing humor with the work. And so it's my pleasure.
Absolutely. And as I mentioned, we will in our show notes have a link to the abstract as well as Kelsey and Emily's book and the empathy boot camps if you're interested in more on this topic. I hope that you learned something. I know I certainly did. And empathy is incredibly important, not only as a general communication tool, but also could not be more relevant for the world that we're all living in, both in our personal lives as well as in our business community as well. So thank all of you very much for joining us for this episode. We'll see you for another one in our series, Understanding People, coming up very soon. So stay tuned to our Get Abstract social media channels to find out our next topic and our next guest. But wherever you are in the world watching this, we wish you a very wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you again soon. Bye.
Thank you.